ability to do this. We forgot to mention that we're recording this session, so you can refer to it later. The ability to integrate t-tests into interactive dashboards has been a huge game changer for both myself and Tom. And again, once you've mastered the basics, which we will do today, this is pretty straightforward to do in Excel. And we will show you how to recreate this particular dashboard in the advanced workshop next week. All right, so you might be wondering at this point, how on earth do you create an interactive dashboard using something as simple as Excel? What's the magic formula behind all of this? What's the secret sauce? Our clients frequently ask us, how did you make that in Excel? I thought you needed Tableau or Power BI to do this. Well, the secret sauce is honestly pretty simple. You basically need two built-in functions in Excel to create an interactive dashboard. So the first function is pivot tables, and the second function is slicers. So that's all you really need. Honestly, pivot tables and pivot charts are kind of like the foundation of an interactive dashboards. So if you know pivot tables, if you're familiar with pivot tables, you are probably going to pick this up very, very quickly. But please do not despair if you've never used a pivot table before. We'll walk you through the basics so that we're all on the same page. All right, let's do a quick poll because we need some audience participation. I have two questions for you. There are no right or wrong answers. It's totally cool if you have never used this stuff before. So using the scale before you, I'd like you to type in the chat box a number that reflects your proficiency using pivot tables. Type in a number. Excellent, excellent. So some of you are relatively new to pivot tables. I would actually place myself at a 3 or a 4. I feel like I know pivot tables, but there are lots of features about pivot tables that I have yet to kind of explore. So I would put myself at a 4. What about slicers? How would you rate yourself when it comes to slicers? A couple of you have used slicers before, which is very rare. Slicers are a little less popular than pivot tables, obviously. Slicers are a relatively new-ish function in Excel, so it does not surprise us to see a lot of zeros and ones here. Well, hopefully by the end of today, your scores on the scale will increase ever so slightly. So maybe we'll do this poll again at the end of today to see how your scores have changed. So we'll do a little pre-post polling. Okay, so here is our agenda for today. The beginner workshop is all about laying the foundation. So first, we're going to introduce you to the Parks method. So the Parks method is our 5-step method for creating a dashboard. So after we practice doing the Parks method a couple of times, and then we're going to send you into breakout rooms where you can practice on your own in groups. Then we're going to all come back together and we'll show you some basic design elements to add to your dashboards. You'll then have another opportunity to work on your dashboards on your own in a breakout room. Tom and I will be in your breakout rooms to check in and answer any questions. And then, of course, we'll finish up our session by doing a little Q&A, and we'll tell you about a homework assignment, quote unquote homework assignment, that you can try out to give you some more practice in dashboarding. All right. Before we open up Excel, let me quickly preview the Parks method. So the Parks method is our 5-step method for creating a dashboard. Why did I call it Parks? Well, one of my favorite TV shows that I binge watched over the pandemic was Parks and Recreation. So this acronym is just easy for me to remember. Hopefully it's easy for you to remember as well. So Parks stands for pivot, analyze, rename, chart, and slice. So essentially what we're going to do is we're going to first insert a pivot table. Then we're going to analyze our data within the pivot table fields. Then we're going to rename or relabel our pivot tables. Then we're going to chart our data. So we're going to create a visualization. And then we're going to insert a slicer, which is kind of the magical ingredient in all of this. Slicers are essentially filters on your data. All right, so Parks method. So let's go ahead and open up the Practice Excel dataset for the beginner workshop. You can download the practice dataset from my website. I think Tom pasted in the link to the website earlier, but Tom, if you could be so kind as to paste it again so everybody has access to it. There it is. Something that I forgot to mention is you are more than welcome to ask questions in the chat as we go, so no need to wait until the end of the workshop. Tom will be monitoring the chat and he will be interjecting occasionally to address any burning questions, so feel free to type in your questions. And please, please, please let me know if I'm going too fast. Without seeing your facial expressions, your facial cues, I have some difficulty knowing if I'm going too fast or just too slow, so please speak up in the chat. Okay, so let's take 2 minutes to get everything set up. So if you haven't done so yet, go ahead and download the Excel spreadsheet for today. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to open up the Excel file. Just 1 minute. All right, I'm going to give everybody just 1 more minute to get organized. It's super helpful if you have 2 screens in front of you so you can kind of see what I'm doing on one screen and try to replicate it on your own screen. Again, remember to please shout out if I'm going too fast. I want to make sure that everybody's getting the support that they need for today. Okay. All right, so this is what your Excel spreadsheet should look like. It's going to be called something weird because my website likes to rename files that I upload. So it's probably going to be called something like Practice Dataset 9 with the 2 in parentheses. It's weird. I don't know. So what you should see when you open up the Excel spreadsheet are 3 tabs: an Introduction tab, a Source Data tab, and a Survey Copy tab. Hopefully everybody sees that. All right, let's go to the Introduction tab. So in almost all of the workbooks that I provide my clients, I always have an Introduction tab. I basically kind of remind them, hey, we did a survey and this dashboard is going to answer these 4 major evaluation questions. So these questions are essentially going to guide the construction of our interactive dashboard. All right, so those 4 questions have to do with sense of community, postgraduate plans, satisfaction, and on-time graduation. Remember, Tom and I are in the STEM education field, so this is a survey that was administered to a group of sophomores and juniors at a local university. Just to give you some context. All right, let's head over to the Survey Copy tab. So again, in all of my workbooks, I also like to provide my client with a copy of the survey. And this is how I organize the survey for them. So they can see the construct or topic, they can see the survey item, and they see the response option. So let's see what we have in this particular survey. So it looks like we have a couple of questions related to sense of community. I feel close to other students. I feel like I have a home or a small community where I belong. Some career awareness and readiness questions. Some satisfaction questions that students had to rate their satisfaction on a scale of 1 to 10. Then we have some pre-post questions that we'll deal with in the advanced workshop. And then we know what students' majors are. Okay, we know what they're majoring in. We know if they have some research experience, and we know their demographics. So we know their gender, their race, ethnicity, and whether or not they're first generation college students. Okay, so we might want to use some of these demographic characteristics to kind of slice and dice the data on them. Well, let's head over to the source data. So this is essentially the raw data from the survey. So the first row has all of the survey items that should be somewhat familiar to you right about now. Each row represents a student, and you'll notice that I assigned an ID number, a totally arbitrary ID number, to every student. Let's scroll all the way to the bottom to see how many students are in our data set. There are a bunch of students who took the survey. I have 584 rows, so that means 583 students completed the survey, right? -1 for the rows, row 1. Okay, so now that you have kind of a feel for the source data, let's go ahead and employ the Parks method. So the first step in Parks, anybody remember? What does the P stand for in Parks? Somebody shout it out or type it in the chat. Yep, pivot. So let's insert a pivot table. So we have to essentially, before inserting a pivot table, tell Excel where the data is located that we want to pivot the data on. So there are different ways of telling Excel where the data is. A super simple way that I like to use is just placing your cursor in cell A1. So just click on A1. Then go up to the insert ribbon. So we're going to select the insert ribbon. And we're going to select pivot table, which is on the far left corner. So select pivot table. All right, it's going to open up a dialog box once you hit pivot table. And you just want to make sure that Excel has grabbed your entire sheet. So it has grabbed the source data A1 to V584. That's correct. And we're going to put it on a new worksheet, right? That's kind of the default in Excel. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK. Once I click OK, Excel is going to open up a brand new sheet for me. All right, brand new sheet. Let me zoom in so you could see this a little bit better. So this is a blank pivot table. One of the first steps that I like to do just to keep everything organized is I like to rename sheet 1 to something that's more identifiable for me. So I'm just going to rename sheet 1. I'm going to call it pivots, because essentially this is where I want to put all of my pivot tables, right? Eventually, once I send this out to my client, I'm going to hide this pivot sheet. So this is just for me. So let's click where it says sheet 1. You might need a double click, sheet 1, and rename it pivot or pivots. All right. So now that we have a blank pivot table, let's start analyzing the data, the A in Parks. So let's start populating some of these pivot table fields. So let's start analyzing what students' plans are after graduation. All right, so let's grab, you'll notice that in this window, there are all of the row headers in my source data, right? So in this little window, it should be somewhat familiar to you. They're all of the questions in my survey, right? So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6th one on the list called plans after graduation. And I'm going to literally grab it and pull it into rows. Okay, what you should notice is that it's automatically populating with all the response options, right? Don't know, employment, gap year, graduate school, medical school, other. Now I need some values. So I need something to put in the values window. And it's a little weird in pivot tables, but what you have to do is actually grab plans after graduation again and put it into the values window. So we're essentially pulling plans after graduation into the rows window, and we're pulling plans after graduation to the values window. Hopefully that makes sense. Let me pause here, see if anybody has any questions so far. This is just kind of fundamentals of pivot tables, but pivot tables are so powerful, I think. I use pivot tables on a daily basis because it's just so easy to analyze your data. All right, let's look at our data. So 583 was the grand total. That is correct. It looks like the majority want to be employed full-time. Now, when it comes to interactive dashboards, I like to work with percentages instead of raw numbers because it's going to be more palatable for your user to interpret. Because remember, we're going to slice and dice things. So let's quickly change our counts to a percentage. All right. Pivot tables are wonderful because you can do this in a few clicks. So what you want to do is you want to right click where it says count of plans after graduation. Okay. In the right click menu, we're going to go down to something called show values as. Pause here. Okay. And now essentially we have a bunch of calculated fields that Excel just gives to us. Excel is really nice sometimes. So what we're going to select is a percent of grand total, right? Because we essentially want the percent of the grand total. And go ahead and click percent of grand total, and that should automatically change your counts to percentages in just a couple of clicks. All right, so we've essentially now done 2 out of the PARCS 5 steps. We've pivoted and we've analyzed our data. Easy so far, right? Wait for the magic to happen, it will come. Okay, so now we need to do the R in the Parks method. Anybody remember what the R is? It's kind of a weird step. And I'll show you why this is kind of an important step a little later on, so stay with me. Anybody remember what the R stands for?
Rename.
Yes, rename. Very good. Sometimes I even forget. Okay, so we're going to rename our pivot table. Again, it's a weird step. Just go with me on this. So what we're going to do is we're going to right click anywhere in our pivot table. So right click anywhere and go down to something called pivot table options. Once you open up pivot table options, there's going to be a lot of options here. But what we care about is up at the top, it's going to say something like pivot table name. And by default, Excel is going to call your pivot tables pivot table 1, pivot table 2, pivot table 3, but we want to make sure that we can identify what that pivot table is. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change that label pivot table 1 to something more identifiable to me. So I'm just going to rename it plans. So in this window right next to pivot table name, it was called pivot table 1. I just deleted that and typed in plans. It doesn't really matter what you rename it, just so it's identifiable to you. So again, I just right clicked in my pivot table. I went to pivot table options and I'm renaming my pivot table. I'm going to go ahead and select OK. Nothing dramatic happened, but go with me on this. Okay, so we've pivoted, we've analyzed, we've renamed. Now we need to chart. We need to create a visualization of our data. So select anywhere in your pivot table. And now we're going to go back to the insert ribbon up at the top. And in the insert ribbon, we're going to go to something called pivot chart. Hopefully you have that on your Excel file, pivot chart. It lives in the chart area. So let's go ahead and click Pivot Chart. If you don't see Pivot Chart, you can also go to Recommended Charts. I think that's it. There are lots of redundancies in Excel. So within recommended charts or pivot charts, let's go with a very simple clustered column chart, which is the first chart that pops up. All right. And let's select OK. And it should look something like this. Hopefully it looks like this on your end. Let me make it a little bigger so everybody can see. All right. It's going to look messy at first, so we need to do a little bit of cleanup. Let me just pause, make sure everybody's caught up. Okay. All right, let's clean this up a little bit. So notice that there are two gray labels on our pivot chart. We want to get rid of those. We want to work with a very clean, minimalistic chart. We don't want a lot of stuff on our dashboard. So I'm going to delete these gray labels. And to delete the gray labels, all you have to do is right-click on one of the gray labels. And it's a little tricky and weird, but you have to select, when you right-click in the menu, hide all field buttons on chart. So don't select remove field. That was an error that I made. Select hide all field buttons on chart. Don't select hide value field buttons on chart. It's hide all field buttons on chart. Just want to point out all the pitfalls that I've run into. Okay, it looks better, right? We've hidden all the gray labels. Now, do you see the total over here? It's called total. There's a total here. There's a total in the header. Let's get rid of the total on the side here because it's totally distracting. So let's just select it and delete it. Yeah, as Tom is pointing out, there's some oddities with using a Mac. You won't have those gray labels, which is kind of nice. All right, so we got rid of the gray labels. We got rid of the total. Now let's rename our chart instead of total, which makes no sense. Let's call this plans after graduation. We're about to get to the fun stuff. So for demonstration purposes, I'm actually going to add the values to all of the charts, all of the columns, just so that we can see as we're kind of manipulating it in real time. So let's go ahead. If you want to follow along, you can. Let's add data labels. And to add data labels, I'm just right-clicking on one of my columns. And in the right-click menu, I'm going to select Add Data Labels. Most things I noticed in Excel live in the right-click menu. So when in doubt, just right-click it. All right, so we're going to add data labels. All right, now for the fun stuff, we're going to finally do the last step in Parks, which is inserting a slicer. So select anywhere in your pivot table. And now for the magical ingredient, we're going to go back to the insert ribbon. And we're going to go to an area that's probably new to a lot of you called the filters area. And you'll notice in the filters, there's slicers and there's timeline. Timeline is kind of cool if you're dealing with dates. You can insert a timeline. So let's go ahead and select slicer. Okay. Again, it's in the insert ribbon in the filter section. Slicer. Okay. Now, what you should see when you select slicer is essentially a list of all of the column headers, right, in your source data. So now Excel wants to know, okay, how do you want to slice and dice the data? What variables do you want to use as filters, right? I like to select no more than 2 or 3 slicers because I notice that my clients get really confused if I have more than 3 slicers. They don't know what to do with themselves. So let's go ahead and select 3 variables to slice and dice our data. So let's select major, student's major. It's probably important. Let's select gender. And let's also select race and ethnicity. And by select, I mean clicking on this empty box and inserting a checkbox. All right, let me pause here, make sure everybody's caught up. It's going to be magical, y'all. Just wait, just wait. Okay, everybody caught up? All right, go ahead and select OK. And now you should see 3 menus with buttons. Okay, I'm just going to size them so you could see it all on my screen. Okay, let's play. So go ahead and select different options within your menus. And what you should be seeing is both your pivot table and your pivot chart being updated in real time, right? So essentially, if I select female, I'm seeing all of the females. And then I selected biology, so I'm essentially seeing all the females who are in biology, how they responded to plans after graduation. And then I can drill into the data even further by selecting URM. URM stands for underrepresented minority student. So now I'm seeing all the biology females who are underrepresented minorities. Pretty cool, right? There's a little quirky feature about slicers that I actually really like and was kind of a surprise for me. And that is, there's this icon called multi-select icon. It looks like 3 check marks. Y'all see that? This little icon over here. If you select the multi-select icon, then you can select more than one button at a time. So for example, once I select the multi-select icon, then I can select biology, chemistry, and neuroscience. So now I can see everybody who's a biology, chemistry, or neuroscience major, right? So this button essentially allows you to select more than one option if you have more than 2 options within a slicer menu. Hopefully that makes sense. And then if you want to clear it, just select the multi-select icon again. And if you want to clear your filters, again, there's that icon. It looks like a filter with a little X next to it, and you can clear your filters. All right, so I just cleared all of my filters. If you're curious to know how your slicer menus are connected to your pivot table and pivot chart, then you can right-click on one of your slicer menus and you can go to something called Report Connections. I think we should actually all do this. So go ahead and right-click on one of your slicer menus and go to Report Connections in the right-click menu. I will mention that soon. Thank you. Very good catch. All right, so if you right-click on one of your slicer menus and go to Report Connections, what you're going to see, and this is kind of an important feature, is you're going to see all of the pivot tables in your entire workbook. So right now, we only see one because we only created one pivot table, right? So it's called Plans, and it's on the Pivots sheet. This is essentially why we renamed our pivot table, because if we didn't rename our pivot table, then it would be called pivot table 1, pivot table 2, pivot table 3, and it gets too much. Take it from us. So that's essentially why we like to rename it. All right. So if your charts are not being modified by the slicers, 99% of the time, it's because your slicer is not connected to your pivot table. Right? So If that happens, just right click. For example, let's see if gender is connected. So I'm just going to right click on my gender slicer, go to report connections, and yes, it's checked off. Sometimes it might not be checked off and you just have to check it, right? And that's kind of a cool feature is you can decide which slicer you want to slice and dice your charts on. There might be an occasion where you don't necessarily want to filter by gender. I can think of a couple of situations. So that's just an important feature. If ever your charts don't work, right click on your slicer menus, go to report connections, make sure it's checked off. Pretty neat, right? Okay, somebody, who was it? Molly brought up an excellent point. Molly said, should we set the axis to be fixed at 100%? It makes the charts a little deceiving when the y-axis keeps changing. Absolutely, Molly. You're a couple of steps ahead of us. So what Molly is basically pointing out is notice that when you're selecting your different buttons in your slicers, the y-axis is constantly being updated. Like now it's from 0% to 30%. And then if I select more buttons, now it's 0 to 40%. So let's go ahead and fix our y-axis, right? So we essentially want to fix it from 0 to 100%. So to do that, I'm going to select my y-axis. I'm going to right click on it. Or a lot of things are in the right click menu. And now I'm going to go down in the right click menu to something called Format Axis. Right? So I just right clicked on my y-axis. I went down to Format Axis. Once you select Format Axis, it's going to pull up this menu on the side over here. And what you want to take a look at is Axis Options, the bounds area. Everybody see that? Right now, Excel is telling me, because I clicked on a bunch of random buttons, 0 to 0.4. Yours might look a little different. Yours might see 0 to 0.6, 0 to 0.3. We want to fix it. So I'm essentially going to set the minimum to 0 and the max to 1, right? Because it's a percentage. So in your bounds, the min and max should now be 0 and 1. And hopefully if you did that correctly, then your y-axis should be modified from 0 to 1. Okay. So far, so good. So now it looks a lot better. Now our y-axis is fixed. For the sake of time, I'm going to resist the urge to further beautify my chart. But in the advanced workshop, Tom is going to tell you, hey, get rid of your lines over here, your grid lines. So I could just delete my grid lines. And you also might want to get rid of the decimal places. You might want to work with whole percentages. And you might want to make your columns a little fatter. That's something else that we can manipulate. But that's essentially, those are the steps. We just went through the Parks method. Is there a way to limit displaying results with you present multiple? I'm just reading your questions to me. Okay, how do we present multiple majors as different bars? So if you want to do that, then you're going to have to create a different type of pivot table. So essentially you want to drag in your major into one of your pivot table fields. So that's going to be a pivot table issue. And if we have time towards the end, I can show you how to do that. All right, let's press on. So now that we created one pivot table and one pivot chart, and we've connected our slicers to our pivot chart, let's go ahead and let's do a second pivot table and pivot chart. Okay, so I'll show you a little hack that Tom and I like to use. What we like to do is instead of grabbing our data again and inserting yet another pivot table, what we have found to be really effective is just copying an existing pivot table. So go ahead and select your existing pivot table. And now we're just going to copy and paste it. And the reason why we like to copy and paste it is because it retains all of the formatting and all of the connections to your slicers. So you essentially don't have to go to report connections and make sure that each of your slicers is connected to your pivot table. Because by copying and pasting, it's already retaining all of those connections. So that's kind of the logic behind that. So once you've grabbed and copied your pivot table, so I'm just going to do a keyboard shortcut of Control-C to copy it. And I'm going to Control-V it to paste it right down below at row 16. Okay, so now I have 2 copies of my pivot table. You'll notice that on my screen, I lost that whole interface related to pivot tables. If that ever happens, just right-click and go to Show Field List. So if you ever lose it, just right-click on your pivot table and go to Show Field List, and it will pop up again. I frequently lose my pivot table fields. All right, so now we need to get rid of everything that's in our pivot table. So now I'm just going to remove everything that's in our rows and our values windows. So I literally just kind of grabbed it and threw it outside. And now I'm basically working with a brand new clean pivot table. And now I'm going to analyze yet another variable. So Rachel is asking about sorting from least to greatest. Yes, there is a way. Hopefully we have time towards the end where I can show you kind of those pivot table features. Okay, so now that we're working with a clean pivot table, let's go ahead and analyze yet another variable. And then we're going to send you to your breakout rooms and you're going to do a third pivot table. Okay, it's just a heads up. So for this next one, let's see if students feel like they can accomplish their degree in 4 years or less. Okay, so the 1, 2, 3, 4th item on the list. Let's literally grab it and drag it into rows again. And let's grab it, drag it into values. And now I want to turn my counts to percentages, right? Hopefully you remember how to do this. So right-click where it says count of I can accomplish my degree in 4 years or less. And remember, we're going to go to Show Values As in the right-click menu. And we're going to select percent of grand total. Hopefully you know the steps by now. We just pause, make sure everybody's caught up. So percent of grand total. Your numbers might look a little different from mine if you have selected something in your slicers. Remember, your slicers are connected to your pivot table. So again, just kind of clear the filters on all of your slicers and you should see the same numbers as me. It always kind of trips people up. Okay. So we see that overall, if we don't select anyone, 67% of students feel like they can accomplish their degree in 4 years or less. I don't know whether that's good or bad, but let's move forward and let's relabel or rename our pivot table. Remember that third step. So I'm just going to right-click on my pivot table. I'm going to go to Pivot Table Options in the right-click menu. And remember, Excel likes to call your pivot table 1, pivot table 2, but we're going to rename that to something more identifiable. What should we label it? Accomplish in 4, maybe? Select OK. Now let's go ahead and insert a chart. Let's visualize our data. So let's go back to the insert ribbon and go to pivot chart. Let's go wild and let's actually select a donut chart. I love donut charts. So what I'm going to do essentially is I selected pivot chart. I'm going to go down to something called pie. And then I'm going to select the donut chart option within my pie option. Hopefully you have a donut option. Okay, let me pause, make sure everybody's caught up. Go ahead and select OK. All right, hopefully you know what to do next, right? We need to get rid of the gray labels. Right click on one of your gray labels, go to hide all field buttons on chart. Hide all field buttons on chart. We got rid of them. Now we're just going to rename where it says total. I don't know why Excel likes to call it total. Let's call this I can accomplish my degree in 4 years or less. Okay. And now let's go ahead and let's see if our data, our pivot table and our pivot chart is being manipulated by our slicers. So I'm just selecting random buttons here. And it looks like it is. Let me add the data labels so you can see it a little clearer. Again, I'm kind of resisting the urge to beautify my charts. We'll do that in the advanced workshop. All right, has it worked on your end? Okay, so you should have 2 charts and 3 slicers. So what I'd like you to do next, and we're about to send you into breakout rooms, is I want you to copy and paste your pivot table again for the 3rd time. You're essentially going to create another pivot table and another pivot chart. Go through the steps, and this time, what I'd like you to do is analyze. I can describe what I can do with my major or degree. Okay, so you see my screen? My screen is visible. Okay, awesome. All right, let me just demo this really quickly, although it seems like most of you got this. So I'm going to copy an existing pivot table. I'm going to paste it below. I'm going to throw out everything that's in my existing pivot table. I'm going to grab, I can describe what I can do with my major or degree. I'm going to pull it into rows and I'm going to pull it into values. Then I'm going to right click where it says count of. I'm going to go to show values as % of grand total. Then I'm going to rename my pivot table. I'm going to right click, go to pivot table options. I'm going to rename it. Oh gosh, what should I rename it? Describe what I can do. All right, now I'm going to chart it. So I'm going to insert a pivot chart. And I'm going to go with what breakout room 1 did, which is just a pie chart. I have my pie chart. I'm going to get rid of the gray labels by right-clicking on them. I'm going to go to hide all field buttons on chart. That's going to remove it. And I'm going to rename this I can describe. what I can do with my major or degree. And I'm going to add data labels. And there we have it. All right, so congratulations, you have the building blocks of a dashboard. So let's go ahead and make our dashboard now, all right? So let's go ahead and open up a new sheet. I'm going to open up a new sheet by clicking on this plus button. And it's going to open up sheet 2 probably on your end. I'm going to rename it. I'm going to double click where it says sheet 2 or sheet 3, whatever it is. I'm going to call this dashboard. So this is essentially where I'm going to build my dashboard. So now what I need to do is I need to bring all of the charts and all of the slicers onto my dashboard. All right, so we're not going to bring over the pivot tables. Remember, we're going to leave all the pivot tables here in the pivots sheet because that's kind of the backbone. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab my 3 charts and I'm going to cut and paste them onto my dashboard. I'm not going to copy them. I'm going to cut and paste them onto my dashboard. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab my 3 slicers and I'm going to cut and paste them onto my dashboard again. All right, so go ahead, grab your 3 charts. I like to grab them all at once by holding them down the control button. So I'm just going to grab all 3 at once by holding down the control button. And I like to use keyboard shortcuts, so I'm going to do Control X to cut it and Control V to paste it. All right, Control X and Control V. Okay. All right, and now I'm just going to organize my charts in kind of a grid-like structure. This is kind of a classic dashboard design. In the advanced workshop, we're going to do something else. All right, so I have my 3 charts. Let's go back to the pivots and let's grab our 3 slicers. So I'm just going to hold down the control button and select my 3 slicers. And then I'm going to use the keyboard shortcut of Control X to cut and Control V to paste. Rachel is asking a question. What happens if you copy instead of cut? Tom, do you want to take this question?
So when you have a smaller data set like this with only a handful of pivot tables and charts, you're not going to run into any issues copying instead of cutting. But if you start having a larger data set with maybe a couple hundred rows and several pivot tables, like, I don't know, 30 or 40 pivot tables, and you're building a dashboard and you're not sure which slicers you're going to include on the dashboard. And so maybe you have 7 or 8 slicers on your pivots tab, then you're going to want to cut and paste because Excel starts running into calculation issues when there are too many copies of the slicers and the charts. It just slows down Excel calculating. So it's just a matter of minimizing the amount of RAM it needs to run your dashboard.
Yep, perfect. Yep, your processing time will lag if you have copies. That's the major issue. All right, so hopefully you've brought over your 3 slicer menus, you've organized them kind of on the left side over here, and you've organized your 3 charts into kind of a grid-like structure. This is the coveted spot where I put plans after graduation. So according to eye tracking studies, this is the spot that people are going to look at first. So just keep that in mind. You want to put the most quote unquote important chart in that area. This is the second most important slot where I can accomplish my degree in 4 years or less. And then once you get into the second row, the eye tracking study suggests that the eye is less likely to look in that area. So just consider that when placing your charts. All right, so the first thing that I like to do is I like to create a header for my dashboard. So to create a header, you can do it in different ways, but what I like to do is I like to insert a shape. I like to insert a big old rectangle up at the top. So I'm going to go to my insert ribbon and I'm going to go down to shapes. And there are different shape options that I can select. I could select a text box or I could just select a rectangle. All right, so insert shapes. I'm going to select my rectangle and then I'm just going to draw that rectangle to size. All right, so literally draw out your rectangle. Okay. And then within your rectangle, you can type in words, double click within your rectangle, and then you can call this, let's say Project ABC, Survey XYZ, just give it a title, arbitrary title for now. And you can make this let's make this a little larger so you guys can see this. Just another little tip. I like to set my viewership at no less than 80%. So I like to zoom out at no more than 80 or no less than 80%. I just find that if I zoom out a little bit further, that it becomes unreadable for my clients. So just set the viewership at no less than 80%. All right, another thing that I like to do is I like to get rid of all of the grid lines so that people don't even recognize this as an Excel spreadsheet, right? Grid lines just kind of scream Excel. So to get rid of the grid lines, we're going to go just to the View ribbon. Right, everybody in the View ribbon. And now we're going to go to an area called Show. Now, by default, in your show area, you're going to have grid lines, formula bar, and headings checked off, right? But you could uncheck where it says grid lines, and then all the grid lines are removed. You could also go so far as to uncheck headings, and then it will get rid of your ABCD column headers and 1, 2, 3 rows. And you can even remove the formula bar, but I'm going to leave the formula bar and the headings as they are because I like to do that at the very end once I've beautified my dashboard. But just these are options, what you could do. Another thing that I like to do is I like to draw the outline of my dashboard. So essentially what that means is I want to fill all of the cells so that my user is only looking in one particular area of my dashboard. So I'm just going to highlight all of these cells, create boundaries. And now I'm going to fill it with a color. I like to use a dark color so that my charts can really pop. So once I've highlighted those cells, I'm going to go to the Home ribbon. And I'm going to select the fill icon. Right? And I'm going to select a dark gray color. Pause here, make sure everybody's up to speed. Okay. Hopefully it looks something like this. And then we can kind of resize maybe the header so that it fits across all of the cells. All right, it's starting to look like a dashboard, right? Another thing that I wanted to show you is you can actually customize the look of your slicers. So let's select one of our slicers, and once you've selected it, What Excel does is it pops up a new ribbon called Slicer, at least in my Excel version, it's called Slicer. It might be called Slicer Analyze or something like that for you all. So once you select Slicer, this new ribbon will give you a bunch of different options, right? There's a lot to look at here. First, notice that there's the report connections over here. So you can always, there's a lot of redundancy in Excel, right? So you can always look at the report connections for that particular slicer over here. Under slicer styles, this is where you can select a different look and feel for your slicer. All right, so I can make one of them orange. You can even customize a brand new slicer. So you'll notice on my screen, I have a group called custom up at the top, and that's because I customize my slicers for particular clients. So that's why mine might look a little different. Another thing that you can do is you can change the look and feel of your buttons, right? So if you go over here to the buttons area, you'll notice that under columns, it says 1. But if I want to make, let's say, non-URM or URM side by side, then I can just change the column from 1 to 2. And then that shifts the look and feel of my buttons around. And of course, I can move this wherever I want. Bring this front. So I might want to put it in my header or whatnot. Okay, so that's one thing you can play around with. You can also manipulate the height and the width of your slicers over here. Okay, I wanted to show you guys custom slicer styles. So to customize your slicer, Sophie, you can go to New Slicer Style. And once you select New Slicer Style, then this is where you can format a brand new slicer that will give you the look and feel that you're going for. Yep. All right, wonderful. These are really great questions. I wanted to show you guys really quickly an underutilized feature of Excel. I think it's an underutilized feature, but I use it all the time because it saved me a ton of time. It's something called themes. Are you guys familiar with themes in Excel and Word? So themes exist in the page layout ribbon. So if you go to page layout, and then if you select themes, you're going to get a bunch of themes, and go ahead and hover over the different themes. And what you should see is all of the slicers and the headers and your charts are being manipulated to look like the style or the theme that you selected, right? So this is so nice because now I don't have to go into every single chart and I don't have to manipulate it and make sure it's the right color. I can just select a theme over here. So that's my dirty little secret of how I make interactive dashboards super fast. All right, so go ahead and select a theme that makes sense to you. And again, you can create your own theme if you want. You can customize the color and the font style. I'm going to select, let's see, I'm going to select a feathered theme. Your themes might look a little different from mine. Go ahead and select a theme that you like. Yep, as you select the theme, it will change into the same font style of your theme, which is nice. And also your slicers are going to change, right? So I selected this feathered theme. And if I go into my slicer menu, now all of my slicer styles are in accordance with that theme. So that's why they look a little different. Are we good so far? Have you customized the look and feel of your dashboard? Okay, before we send you into your breakout rooms to kind of further play around with this and customize your dashboard however you want, There's one more thing that I think is missing, and that is a dynamic N count. All right, anybody know what I'm talking about by when I say dynamic N count? Somebody unmute and share what you think I mean when I say dynamic N count.
The total number, like as you're changing it, to kind of say n equals however much it is.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, perfect. Yeah, so right now, if I select female, for example, and I see that about 31% want to be employed full-time, I don't know what that's out of, and then if I further select biology and underrepresented minority students, again, is that 16% out of 5 students? How many are we talking about here? So essentially what we need to do, what Tom and I highly recommend, is that you put a dynamic N count so people can interpret the data properly, right? So we're going to have to hack it a little bit in Excel. All right, so we're going to put the N count right at the bottom over here. Let me zoom in so you could see this. All right, so we're going to put the N count somewhere over here. So in one of the cells, I'm just going to write the words number of students. All right, I'm going to make that white so you can see what that looks like. All right, number of students, and I'm just going to merge and center that so you can see it. Okay, and then right below number of students, this is where I'm going to put the dynamic N count. So to create a dynamic N count, what we need to do is we need to create another pivot table. Okay, so go back to your pivots sheet, and we're going to create a new pivot table. So I'm going to copy an existing sheet, just how I normally do. Copy, and I'm going, copy this one. Copy, and let's place it down at row 40. Okay. And my field list is missing, so I'm just going to right click and select show field list. I'm going to get rid of everything that's inside here to work with a brand new pivot table. And now what I want to do is, again, I'm going to kind of hack it a little bit because there is no N count here. I'm going to grab ID number, all right? I'm going to grab ID number and I'm going to place that in the values field. So remember, every student has an ID number. Now, by default, Excel thinks, because it's numbers, that I want a sum of ID number, right? But that makes no sense to sum people's ID numbers. So instead, what we want is a count, right? So I'm going to right click where it says sum of ID number. And in my right click menu, there are a bunch of different options. So we worked in show values as, but you can go into summarize values by, and this is where you can select a count, an average, a max, or a min. So we'll go ahead and select count under your right click menu. All right, mine says 30. The reason why mine says 30 is because I selected different buttons on my slicers, so I forgot to clear my slicers. So there are 30 female biology URM students, but now there are, since I cleared all of my filters, there are 583 students, which totally makes sense, right? So now essentially, because remember we copied and pasted, so they're already connected to the slicers. That's why that number can be manipulated. So now essentially what we want to do is we want to place this number in our dashboard. There's a simple way of bringing that number in and a more sophisticated way that Tom is going to show you in the advanced workshop. Let's do the easy way. So go back to your dashboard, and right underneath number of students, we're going to reference that cell in our pivots sheet. So right underneath it, I'm just going to click on a cell A28 in my place. I'm going to go to the functions window and I'm going to go equals. And then I'm going to grab this number in A41 on my pivots sheet. So I just selected it essentially. And then I'm going to hit enter and the number should pop up. Make it in white so you can see it. All right, so again, let me do it right below. I'm just going to type in equals. And I'm going to select this number over here. And the reason why I know Excel is selecting it is because there are these green dashes that are kind of saying, hey, I'm selecting this. And then I'm just going to hit enter, and then the number should pop up. All right. Let me just merge and center this across so you can see it a little bit better. Okay, and now go ahead and select your slicers, and what you should see happen is that your slicers are manipulating this number down below where it says, in my case, 17. All right, so that's how to add a dynamic end count. I highly, highly recommend doing so, or else people are going to misinterpret the numbers on your dashboard. Okay. Who needs to see that process again of how to bring in the dynamic end count? If you're going to join us in the advanced workshop, Tom is going to show you a different way that you can insert a dynamic end count. It's a little bit more sophisticated. All right, everybody got the dynamic end count? Okay, before we send you to your breakout rooms, I want to show you one other thing of how to secure your dashboards, or actually your dashboard workbooks. Okay, so now we're going into the security zone of dashboarding. Okay, so one thing that Tom and I have learned is that you do not want to share your workbook with a client with all of the data, the raw data available to them, and all of the pivots tables available to them. So what we like to do is two things. First, we like to hide all of the tabs that we don't want people to see, right? We definitely, Tom and I work in the education sector. Tom and I work in the education sector, and it's a big no-no to share raw data of students, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hide my source data. So I'm just going to right-click where it says source data. And I'm going to select hide. And I'm also going to hide my pivots sheet. So I'm just going to right-click where it says pivots. And I'm going to hide my pivots sheet. Why do you think I want to hide my pivots sheet? Why don't we want people to have access to our pivots sheet?
Well, can't you hover over the pivot chart and it'll produce your table, the source data?
Yep, it can produce our table. We're going to have to do something about that. But essentially, the reason why we don't want people to have access to our pivots sheet is because they can manipulate your pivots tables, and then all of your slicers and your pivot charts are going to look scary. And that's actually happened to me. All right, so in addition to hiding our sheets, Tom and I also like to add to password protect our workbook such that people will not be able to unhide any of our sheets. So it's possible, we just hid our sheets, but you can also unhide the sheets, and then people will have access to all of your sheets. right? By just right-clicking and then selecting unhide. But we don't want people to have the ability to do that. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to go to something called review. And we're going to password protect our workbook structure such that nobody can unhide anything. All right. So go to the review ribbon and select protect workbook. All right. So I just went to the review ribbon. I selected protect workbook. Make sure that structure is checked off. Okay. And then put in a password. All right. So I'm going to type in test, T-E-S-T, just for demonstration purposes. Remember what your password is. There's so many workbooks where I'm just like, what was the password for this? Select OK. Then re-enter your password again, test. Select OK. And now try to unhide your sheets. You will not be able to. All right, so right click on one of your tabs. You are not going to be able to unhide any of your sheets, which is what we want. We don't want people to unhide our sheets. All right. So that's one way to secure your dashboard that I highly recommend, especially if you're in the education or health sector. Another thing that I think, Christine, you pointed out, which is a really good one, is that you can actually manipulate your pivot chart in your dashboard, right? So I could select my pivot chart, go to show field list, and then here's another way that I can manipulate my pivot chart. We don't want people to do that. We also don't necessarily want people to start moving around our charts, right? So you can literally drag and move these charts around. And once we've selected a style and we've organized our charts, we don't want people to be able to do this. So what we're going to do is we're going to protect our sheet. So it lives right in the review ribbon, right next to protect workbook. We're going to select protect sheet. But the trick when you have slicers is that you don't want to lock or protect your sheet without unlocking your slicers first. So Excel is weird. It locks your slicers. I'll show you what I mean by this. So before we're going to protect our sheet, we need to make sure that our slicers are unlocked so that people can still use our slicers. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select my 3 slicers. And I just held down the control key to select all 3. And then as the 3 slicers are selected, I'm going to right click. Okay. And I'm going to go down to something called, oh gosh, I think it's size and properties, right? Okay, so I'm going to go down to something weird called size and properties. And I have all of these steps, by the way, on my website, and I'll show you where that lives so that you don't have to remember everything. But you will have this video so you can refer back. So I'm going to select size and properties. Okay. It's going to open up a menu on the side over here. Select properties. And then you'll notice that Excel has locked everything in place. There's a green check mark next to locked. We're just going to uncheck that. So that's essentially unlocking your slicers. Okay, so again, I right clicked, I went into size and properties, I went into properties and unlocked it. And while we're here, there are other things you can do. You can go into position and layout and disable resizing and moving. So that means that your user will not be able to move around your slicers. Okay, so now that we've unlocked our slicers, now we can protect our sheet. So I'm going to go back to the review ribbon. I'm going to select protect sheet. I'm going to just leave all the defaults in place. I'm going to put in a password, test. Select OK. Put in test again, select OK. And now, hopefully, I'm trying to move my charts and I cannot move my charts, but I can select my slicers. Alrighty, so that's how to protect your workbook structure and protect your dashboard itself. Tom, am I missing any other essential features on a dashboard? Trying to think. Okay. Well, let's send you guys into your breakout rooms. And what you're going to do in your breakout rooms is you're going to, if you haven't gotten caught up, add your dynamic end count, play around with the different themes, and play around also with the protect workbook and unprotect your sheet, protecting your sheet. Make sure that you know how to do that. And Tom and I will be in and out of your breakout rooms to answer any questions. So essentially your task is to further beautify your dashboard, make sure that you know all of these essential elements. Okay. Well, welcome back, everyone. I hope you had fun beautifying your dashboards, password protecting your dashboards. We have about 10 minutes left, so we wanted to reserve 10 minutes for your questions. So please feel free to add your questions to the chat box, and Tom and I will try to answer them.
Small enough group, if you just want to unmute and shout out your questions, that works too.
I have a quick question if I could share my screen. There's something funky going on here. So on this, on the donut, you see how it's showing like no 28%? How come there's so many data labels on my donut?
So you should be able to format what is showing up on your data labels. So if you, format selection. Format data label, the very bottom one.
Oh, one. Okay.
Yeah, see how you have so many things selected there?
Oh, okay. So it should just be value, right?
Probably.
Okay. Thank you.
I usually do category name and value that way, and I delete the legend. But if you want to leave the legend up and then have your
There. Perfect. Thank you.
I like the way your dashboard looks. It looks really professional.
Just added some shadows.
Good job. Yeah. Good job.
We had a question if there was an easy way to lock how much someone can zoom in or zoom out on your page.
So some of those view settings, for example, when Shelly was showing you how to hide the grid lines and the formula bar and the headers, the A, B, C, D, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then the zoom, those are individually set. So you might go through and set all of those fun settings and it looks great on yours, but when you send it to your client and they open it up, that resets. And so I have learned,
okay.
Yeah, I have learned that that's an extra step that when I look at it, it looks amazing and pretty, but when the client opens it, they see the A, B, C, D, 1, 2, 3, they see the formula bar, it resets to whatever Zoom setting they had it as. I was like, oh man.
Yeah, interesting. Okay.
Rachel asked about further customizing the slicer menus, specifically resizing the text and changing it to a drop-down menu instead of buttons. So you can edit the fonts and colors and layout of the buttons to the nth degree, right? I don't know how much time you want to spend doing that, but I can show you where those options are. So actually, I need to unprotect my sheet here. So for my slicer, if I come down here to new slicer style, within here, you can edit, like I go to format, you can edit the fonts and the borders and the fills as much as you want to. All right. I has found that that is a lot of work for very little payoff in return. And it's just easier to play around with the theme and find a slicer style that works with my theme. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. As far as the drop-down menus instead of buttons, there's no way to easily do drop-down menus instead of buttons for an interactive dashboard. Like the slicers are going to be buttons. You can't just change those to a drop-down menu. And the opposite is true in Google. In Google, it's going to be a drop-down menu, and there's no way to change it to a button. Okay. However, there is a very complicated way of using drop-down menus and pivot tables to create a dashboard, but that doesn't revolve around slicers, and it's a little bit more intensive than the method that we've shown you here today. That's my answer. It can be done. It's very complicated and not worth your time.
I still think that if we could present the, let's say, the bars for the slicer for different majors as different bars would be a good comparison. So how could we do that? When I take 3 out of the 5, let's say.
Right. So, for example, I think major is really good, but in our work as a STEM education, like NSF has this big initiative about broadening participation. And so a lot of times what we want to compare is male versus female, or underrepresented versus non-underrepresented. And so you can include those as part of your axes in your charts, right? So for example, plans after graduation, we could have made that a dual column chart and had male versus female on there. The trick to that, though, is that's when you want to pay close attention to your slicers and their report connections. Is if I put gender as part of my chart, then I don't want the gender slicer connected to that chart. Because if I start slicing on gender, I'm going to lose parts of my chart. It's going to lose, I'm going to lose a color of bars. Does it make sense? Or do you need me to show you what I'm talking about?
If you can show it, because usually if by Excel, we just choose it, choose the cross steps, right? It's okay. Yeah, thanks. If you could show it.
Okay. I need to unhide my pivots. So let's go back up here to plans after graduation. And I need my field list. And I'm going to throw gender into the columns, right? So now I have male versus female in my pivot table. When I go back to my dashboard, now I see I have male versus female within my dashboard.
Yeah.
All right, I'm gonna go ahead and put the legend on here for now, right? And so I can compare male versus female.
Yeah.
However, when I hit my, so when I hit my slicer, I lost the males, or I'm gonna lose the females. And I just want to maintain that comparison as I'm going through here. And so what I recommend, no, it's locked. Sorry. So what I recommend is for your slicer to go back to the report connections. Now this is my plans after graduation. Deselect that for gender. And so now my gender slicer isn't affecting my plans after graduation's chart. It's still affecting my other two charts though. And my other slicers are still working on my plans after graduation chart.
Interesting. Yep. Thank you very much. Because that's what I usually do. I do a cross step to present them. Okay, thanks.
So I think we're almost out of time. I wanted to show you guys two things on my website. So the first thing I wanted to show you, just so you know that it's accessible, is if you go to my website and go to tips and tricks, then I've basically done screenshots of all of the steps related to the Parks method. So you can go to tip number 1, how to use the Parks method. You can go to tip number 3, how to password protect your dashboards. Tip 4 is including a dynamic end count. So feel free to refer to the tips and tricks when you're working on your dashboards, and you'll also have this video recording, but I think the video recording is just going to be up for about 2 weeks. So just so that you know, this resource is available to you. And then you can also grab all of my free sample dashboards. I have about 10 different dashboards. So I didn't hide anything or lock anything, so you can see kind of what's going on in the background. I have some qualitative dashboards if you're interested in seeing how to work with an interactive dashboard using qualitative data. And then I also wanted to show you guys that we have an optional homework if you're interested in getting more experience on this. So if you go to February 2023 workshops, there's an optional homework assignment. You can download it, try your hand at working through another interactive dashboard, and then you can share it with Tom and I, and we can give you some feedback if you would like. And then in the advanced workshop, I know a lot of you are going to join us for the advanced workshop. We're actually going to go through the homework to see how to do it. So just some things for you guys to keep in mind. Yeah, and thank you, Tom, for adding the links.
I might not be the only one who thinks they might need to come back to the recording for a refresher. How would we be able to access that?
After we get done today, I am going to upload it to YouTube and share that privately with you via email. So the same email that you got your Zoom link through for today, you'll get an email from me with the link for the YouTube.
Fantastic, thank you.
All right, everyone, that's it. Let's wrap up. Thank you all. Have a wonderful, relaxing weekend. Stay warm.
Thank you so much.
Shelley. Thanks, Tom.
You.
Thank
Thank you.
you.
Thank you.